She was a traveler, journeying in seek of thrill and life enrichment before their fateful encounter at a local noble's party. He was there for one reason that night: to find his next victim, his next life-giving source. Their meeting was stereotypical, one of the likeness of a romance novel. Their eyes met across the dance floor, past the crowd. She was attracted to his sly grin and stare, but only her supple flesh interested him. Quite the bite, he thought to himself. She lusts. Her blood must be hot. It beckons me, and I will answer its call. He calmly walked across the floor, his gaze fixed on hers, and she swooned and blushed. He seemed to glide as if he willed himself to her without walking at all. His grace was unrivaled, save for that of the object of his stare. He stopped in front of her, staring slightly down into her pale blue eyes, and they were of a heaven he would never know. "Good evening, my fair young maiden," he softly greeted, kissing her hand, but felt no flesh there. Her silk glove held a beautiful secret.
"And to you, good sir,"
she squeaked, lightly giggling. She averted her gaze, her nearly involuntary smile lined with reddened cheeks. He paused, following her eyes, and his smile hypnotized her further. "Your eyes seem lonely, my dear. How might one so radiant, one so alluring, come to such an event unaccompanied? Surely the men realize that you alone illuminate this dark night. Do they not?" Words escaped her, her rapidly pounding heart rendering her breathless. "Might I have the honor of being your partner for this evening? Would you lend me happiness and your hand in a dance?" Finally, she became confident enough to respond.
"Might I ask the name of my insistent yet handsome flatterer?"
she coyly inquired, with a raised eyebrow and half-smile. "Call me Adrian," he replied, never dropping his own devilish grin.
"Well, Adrian, I'd be happy to have you call me,"
she said, taking his hand and approaching the dance floor. As the violinists began the music in light-hearted play, they bowed to one another before embracing. The music gained tempo, and they waltzed to an isolation of their hearts. They ruled the world, for in that moment, only they existed. The music quickened further, as did their steps in sync with it, and the floor seemed to heat itself beneath them. She stared into his eyes as the song declined to a slow-paced end, and they seemed to catch the combined flame of the surrounding candles, as well as her heart. He returned her deep gaze, and for the first time in ages, saw into her eyes, past the flesh, and to her very soul. For the first time in ages, he knew true love. Her eyes were magnetic, and they drew one to the other into a soft kiss. "I never asked your name, did I?" he asked in a whisper.
Emma Lamont,"
she replied with a warm smile. That night, she explored the town with him, and the both of them found utter joy in idle banter, laughing, growing closer, and their hearts bound. The night refused to end, but the air grew cold, and they sought shelter and comfort in the study of his mansion. Their conversation continued for hours, and the glow of the fireplace dimmed. She fell asleep against his arm, carefree and glowing with newly found love. He carried her up the stairs to his bedroom and laid her beneath the sheets and quilts, watching over her for a moment. She truly was of a heaven he would never know. As he headed for the door, she stirred awake, calling for him in a tender voice.
Adrian, don't leave me.
She pleaded, reaching for him.
Come, stay with me.
He smiled, the smile that decorated his otherwise glum face the entire night, and returned to her side, lying next to her. They made love till the full moon shone brilliantly through his window, and, at a satisfied rest, shared a goblet of red wine, promising to never let the passion of that night end, even if destiny parted them. Through eternity, they would keep the moment. All was peaceful for the following few hours, and sleep came over them in a protective embrace beneath the sheets. Soon, however, he awoke, and his torso burned fiercely, leaving him in hyperventilation. In his night of love and passion, he had forgotten to feed. He grew weak, his legs felt unstable, and his vision became hazy. He was left with no other choice, for the urge for survival was dominant over love. He returned to the room, breathless, and opened the door in haste. She awakened and attempted to ask what ailed him, but to no avail. He could no longer control his actions. He lunged for her and bit down deep into her throat, tearing at her jugular vein and gulping the red flow. Upon gaining control, he looked down at his blood-soaked sheets and the shell of his former infatuation, and realized what horrible deed he had done. He could do naught but isolate himself in the corner and weep. From that night on, immortality was a lonely curse. The goblet he now held was the very one that they shared, and now it would take place in his undoing. Sitting at the far end of the table, he placed the goblet before him and examined the edge of the dagger, gripping it rigidly. They say one goes mad if he feeds on his own blood, he murmured to himself. Well, better mad than aware of my everlasting torment. Without much thought, he slowly slit his left wrist, holding the wound over the goblet, and tensing his fist and forearm slightly to extract the blood. When nearly half full, he brought it to his lips, but did not drink. A thought passed his mind. Would heaven make an exception for the damned that loved and lost? Would God turn away he who had killed, but cast away his own threat to man? Cast away his curse in respect for life? Even if not, an eternity in hell would be a release from an eternity in this accursed flesh. I'll not deal another the fate that parted me from Emma! He shouted in rage, throwing the goblet aside against the wall. He clenched his fist hard, and his entire arm shook with the force. Blood began pouring onto the table, coating the surface, then dripping over the side and onto the stone floor. He winced as he felt his immortality slip away, along with all of his powers. Yet he remained steadfast in his endeavor. He would steal the death that he was so long ago denied. His body began to flail, his eyes grew bloodshot, and blood seeped from his lips and nostrils. Eventually his weakness overcame him, and his pale, limp body fell upon the table in its own lifeblood. But the flow continued. His eyes remained opened, and he stared silently, breathlessly into the shadows. Darkness shrouded the glimmer of the room's glass and crystal, and he stared onward. For what seemed like days, he wasn't sure if he had truly died or not. But time weighed heavily, and at last, with the final calling of his beloved's name, he forced himself to pass away from the world of the living. No one knows the fate of a vampire after death, and no one can know if he returned to his lost love. Nevertheless, one can assume his fate. His last expression held no grimace or pain, but peace.